Okay, I think everybody is in. Let me just do a quick check. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the National Association of Japanese Canadians webinar. We're very pleased to have the Landscapes of Injustice book launch. My name is Lorena Kawa. I'm president of the National Association of Japanese Canadians and also vice chair of the steering committee. First off, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded and traditional ancestral lands of the Katsi, Kaitlin, Matsqui, and Semiahmoo First Nations. And wherever you are across Canada, US, or whatever country, please give a thought to the Indigenous territories you are on. Thank you. So first, a few little housekeeping bits. We are going to keep everyone on mute except for the presenters. And after the session, the speakers have had a chance to share their marvelous information. Then you will have an opportunity for a question and answer, and then we will unmute at that time. The session is being recorded because there was a lot of interest in this program, and so we are going to have the recording available for you. If you do not want to be recorded, please turn off your video cam, and then you will not be recorded. With that, thank you so much, and it is my pleasure to welcome Jordan Stanger-Ross, who is the chair of the steering committee, and he will enlighten you more about Landscapes of Injustice. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Jordan Stanger-Ross, Associate Professor of History at the University of Victoria and the Project Director of Landscapes of Injustice. A really big thank you to Laureen and Kevin and the whole NAJC for supporting this work all along and for giving us a chance to launch this book in this context in genuine connection with the community most affected by the history that we've been researching. In 1942, as most people on this call will know very well, the Canadian government uprooted and interned all Japanese Canadians living within 100 miles of the Pacific coast. And it promised at that time that their property would be preserved and protected in their interest, their homes, farms, personal belongings, businesses, returned to them as soon as possible. But in the days, weeks, and months that followed, the government neglected that responsibility, allowing thieves to steal and looters to destroy the property of Japanese Canadians. And then in January 1943, officials decided that they would sell everything that remained. This meant that Japanese Canadians had to recover not only from a temporary uprooting at a time of war, but rather from the permanent loss of homes and communities. So that in 1949, when they were finally freed from all restrictions, finally permitted to return to the places where they had formerly lived, they had nothing to return to. Landscapes of Injustice is a partnership project funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We're based at the Centre for Asia-Pacific Initiatives at the University of Victoria and have partners across the country, both in universities and in organizations outside of universities. Since 2014, academics such as myself have been working together with partner organizations like the NAJC and the Nikkei National Museum and the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center to tell this history. A history of injustice perpetrated against Japanese Canadians that focuses on the permanent destruction of their homes and communities, as well as their responses to that injustice. And we're now very proud to be able to present our results. These results come in a variety of forms. Working with experienced teachers, we've created resources to support their peers who will teach this history in elementary and secondary school classrooms across Canada. Together with curators at the Nikkei National Museum and the Royal BC Museum, we've created an exhibit, Broken Promises, to share this history. A narrative website provides a deeper dive into the story and the documents behind it. And eventually our digital archive will go live, providing access to all of the documents that underlie our findings. The book we're here to discuss, Landscapes of Injustice, a new perspective on the internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians, is foundational to all of these other outputs. It's a collective work. It represents the collaborative efforts of 15 authors and many other participants in our project to tell the history of the dispossession. 3 key contributors to that work, both in their writing and in the project in general, are here to share their work with us tonight. And it's with very sincere gratitude that I introduce them to you. Audrey Kobayashi is a distinguished professor of geography at Queen's University and a member of the Executive Committee of Landscapes of Injustice, among other projects. Hers is the first chapter of the book, and it explains how property ownership was crucial to Japanese migration to Canada beginning in the 19th century and onwards. And she also has a chapter in the book co-authored with Art Mickey about the Japanese-Canadian campaign for redress. Nick Blomley is another professor of geography at Simon Fraser University and also a member of the LOI Executive Committee. An internationally recognized expert on property, Nick is the co-author of 2 chapters in the book, including the one he'll speak about tonight, which I had the pleasure of writing with him. Nick will talk about the protests voiced by Japanese Canadians when they learned that their properties were being sold. And Kaitlin Findlay started on our project as a master's student in history at the University of Victoria and has worked for 2 years as the research coordinator of the project, supporting all of our research outputs. She's the author or co-author of 4 chapters in the book and will speak today about her work with oral histories in which Japanese Canadians look back on the losses of the 1940s. The format will involve short answers to 3 questions. 2 that have been advertised in advance to the authors, and a third which I'll make up as we go along in response to what they've said. They'll each give short answers, and we'll aim to be done all of that discussion in about 45 minutes, after which we'll open the line for Q&A with the wider audience. And the formal sessions end after an hour, but we're able to be here for 75 minutes if audience members want to stay on for longer to ask additional questions. So with that brief introduction, I'll go ahead and start with the first question, and we'll go from Audrey to Nick to Kaitlin. So briefly, Audrey, can you explain how you've been involved in the Landscapes of Injustice project and why? Remember to unmute, Audrey.
Okay, I think I've been involved from the very beginning because I remember that Jordan and I had discussions going way back to before the application was even written. And then I was somewhat involved in writing the application and have just been deeply involved ever since on a bunch of committees, but specifically the steering committee and the executive. And for me in particular, this was an opportunity both to work with all of these wonderful people and the Japanese Canadian community, where I've been working for many years, and also to use the research that I've been doing for the past 40 years in a way that was applicable to the project and the aims of the project. I'd also mention that I, along with Nick and Sherry Kajiwara, are part of the Right to Remain project, which is looking at present day Powell Street and is aimed at the activist project of keeping people in their homes that were, of course, vacated when the Japanese Canadians were kicked out of them in the 1940s. So it's very important to me to make that connection between the 2 projects, both of which focus on dispossession, on home, and on injustice.
Thank you, Audrey. Nick.
Thank you, Jordan, and sincere thanks to the NAJC for hosting this event. Yeah, I'm Nick Blomley. I'm a professor of geography at SFU, as mentioned. I wasn't quite involved as early as Audrey was, but I certainly came on board 7 years ago when we started. Was it 7 years ago? It feels like it's been a long time. And it's such a wonderful group of people that I've learned so much from, community folk as well as scholars. So I was involved in part because SFU, where I teach, is a partner, and there are various universities that have been partnered with the University of Victoria. Have been involved in that several of my graduate students have been participants in this project, and this is crucial to the project, that wonderful people like Kaitlin and many others who have been working on this project and learning through this project, as we all have in many, many ways. And some of them, like Kaitlin, or like my former master student, Rebecca Salas, actually not only were research assistants, but actually also did research in their own master's projects that related directly to this story of dispossession. In Rebecca's case, it was the story of oral histories. And I was also keen to be involved because it's a story that I, to my shame, did not know much about. And uncovering this story seemed to me such a crucial form of academic engagement. I'm somebody who's also interested in property, and I'm interested in property not because property is simply some technical or narrowly economic phenomenon, but property connects in so many ways to questions of home, as Audrey put it, to loss, to questions of citizenship, to justice, and to recognition, or in some cases, sadly, the lack of recognition, which I think this story is in some senses a story about.
Thanks so much, Nick. And Kaitlin.
Thanks, Jordan. And thanks to Laureen and Mike for organizing this. I'm happy. So hi to all the familiar faces in the crowd. I've been introduced a bit. I came on to the project as a student, and I'm one of the many, many students that had the opportunity to receive training from Landscapes of Injustice. And so right away, as soon as I started my master's, I was also digitizing our archival materials that will contribute to the digital archive, which will launch in the coming year. I wrote my master's thesis under Jordan, and then had the opportunity to turn that work into one of the chapters of the book. And after I defended my thesis, I continued working as the research coordinator for the project, which in short means that I was so familiar with the nooks and crannies of the project from all the research assistant positions I had, that I proved very useful to all the outreach initiatives that they have. So I'm sort of a project archivist, and they ask me for things and I send them their way. Like Nick, I knew enough about this history coming on that I wanted to learn more. And I was in the beginning interested in what histories are remembered and forgotten, and why. And it's really just been an honor to have spent the last 5 years working on this project, and calling this group of people my colleagues, and just being able to give my time to something that's so important.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kaitlin. I think maybe we'll go in the same order for the second question. So starting with Audrey, can you describe your contribution to the book by giving our audience a key example or quote and elaborating on how that fits into your argument? Remember to unmute, Audrey. There we go.
Sorry, I was hitting that button hard. Okay, so my chapter is chapter 1, because I go way back historically, before the 1940s, to ask the question of what property might mean in a traditional Japanese context, and how that might influence Japanese Canadians and the meaning of their property when it was taken from them. So I begin by asking, what are the cultural considerations that can help us to understand the meaning for these ordinary people who were wrenched from their land holdings? And I'm very fortunate, as many of you know, to have a huge amount of data on the history of Japanese Canadian community and the history of emigration from Japan. So I pulled a whole bunch of this together to look at property holdings in Japan, and also to do a kind of meta-analysis of the political economy of property in the Meiji period in Japan, which of course began in the 1860s. And just very briefly, in the transition from the Tokugawa to the Meiji period, for the first time in Japanese history, ordinary common people were able to own land and were given a form of citizenship. And the old noble structure began to break down. At the same time, with this right of citizenship, which people soon took to be very important in their lives, came the obligation of taxation, which created a huge burden. So the Meiji period, very briefly, was one of a contradiction between the rights of citizenship, which were reinforced by the notion of family, by the notion of place within one's village, and also by religious principles that are found in both Buddhism and even more in Shinto. And the contradiction was that they were required to pay taxes, which meant that they couldn't hang on to the land even if they managed to obtain it. And yet that was their main form of social status. So the other contradiction is that as the agrarian way of life became more and more vaunted, Japan needed labor to industrialize. And so the majority of the population ended up moving to industrial settings. This labor transformation is what explains emigration to Canada. And very briefly, when people emigrated, their objective was to be able to earn money in Canada, ironically, usually in an industrial setting such as sawmills, and go back to Japan and buy property and exercise their rights of citizenship in Japan. This was especially important for first sons, who were the successor sons of the household. Most of them actually did go back and represent a kind of anomaly within Japanese society, where lots and lots of immigrants went back and became agrarian instead of industrial. Those who didn't go back were actually mainly non-successor sons. Only men, of course, held property. And they carried many of the ideals, the agrarian ideals of Meiji Japan, along with the sense of family, the sense of home, some religious sense, although that gets very complex. And so we have to understand that their property carries on long cultural traditions established in Japan with huge meaning in terms of citizenship, which is different from just holding a passport, and in terms of their identity within their own community. So that when the losses of the 1940s occurred, the loss was not simply of a title to land or land that is worth a certain amount of money, but it was a loss of that sense of self, loss of the sense of being able to maintain a family in a way that was deemed appropriate within a Japanese tradition and then in a Japanese Canadian tradition. And my 5 minutes is up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Audrey. It's a wonderful foundation for the Canadian side of the story that we begin to tell now with Nick.
Okay. Juggling with mutes. Thank you, Audrey. And our chapter, the chapter that Jordan and I wrote together, connects in many ways with this story of loss. And the quote that I want to give is actually the quote that we use to start for the title of the chapter. And the quotation is, quote, "My land is worth $1 million." And that is a quote from a man called Yoichi Okuma. And it's in a letter that he wrote to the so-called custodian of enemy property in July the 3rd, 1944. And it's one of a remarkable archive of nearly 300 letters written by Japanese Canadians between 1943 and 47. And it was a largely unexplored resource that we were able to delve into in the chapter. And I'll explain the significance of the quote in just 1 minute, but just by way of context, what these letters are responses to form letters, essentially sent by the custodian to owners, informing them that the property that they assumed that the custodian was going to protect for them had been sold against their will, often for less than market value. And not surprisingly, this was something of a surprise to people like Mr. Okuma. And so they write letters which take various forms, but generally speaking are, of course, letters of protest and dissent. These letters were largely ignored by the state. So we try and take them seriously. What they allow us to do is to get into this moment of dispossession and also speak to the, in some ways, the specific and complex harms of property loss, the injustice of dispossession. The letters really center on what was lost, how it was lost, and what that loss signified. And most immediately, and this gets us back to Mr. Okuma's "My land is worth $1 million," is they reveal this profound mismatch between the way the government is valuing, or we would argue devaluing, Japanese Canadian property and Japanese Canadians themselves, which is exclusively about cash value, undervaluing the complex and very layered ways in which Japanese Canadians value their own property. And some of this, as Audrey points out, of course, is deeply, deeply cultural. But it speaks to all sorts of multiple relationships that people have to not only to land, but to family, to the places that they have made and occupied over time, to the labor they've invested in their farms. Mr. Okuma is a farmer, or was a farmer. They challenge the cash value, but they also challenge the very idea, and this is where Mr. Okuma's quote is so powerful, they challenge the very idea that their property can be turned into something like cash value. So Mr. Okuma is saying, my land is worth $1 million. $1 million in 1944 is an unimaginable sum. Now you could buy a small house on the east side of Vancouver, but in 1944, of course, it was, an unimaginable sum. So what he's saying effectively is that my land has no cash value. It's beyond cash value because of the multiple investments of time, of love, of labor, of hope that he has invested in that land. And now, of course, that has been denied. So the injustice in this sense, I think this quote indicates, reflects a profound, a deeply racist devaluation of a people and the relationships that they have to their property, and by extension, the relationships that they have to their places, to their histories, to families, and to relations more generally. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And now, Kaitlin, if you want to talk about your chapter and maybe a quote that stands out for you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jordan. So for those of you who are still waiting for your book in the mail, the book follows it's divided into 4 main sections. The first is the deliberate killing of home. What did home mean to Japanese Canadians? How did they value their property? What lives did they live? The next is dispossession required work. So the work of administrators, but also to resist that dispossession. And that's where these letters of protest really fit. The third section is called Reasoning Wrong. And then we really dive into the policy and how Canadian officials could say that this is in Japanese Canadians' best interest. And the fourth section is Dispossession is Permanent. So once people have been robbed of their home, once their home has been destroyed, that simply can't be undone. And so that's where this chapter that I'll discuss fits into what I also think of is legacies. What are the legacies of dispossession? And I'm going to speak just a bit differently about this chapter because it's from oral histories of Japanese Canadians, and even some people that are joining us today did interviews with Landscapes of Injustice. And we didn't take, for this chapter, we didn't attempt to come to a single clear-cut conclusion about what the legacies were for Japanese Canadians, but rather my co-authors and I, which included Jordan and Dr. Heather Reed in Ontario, we just tried to work through the oral histories and talk about what we were noticing within them. And I think first and foremost for myself is I hope that this chapter serves as an entry point for people who are just learning about the history to get a sense of the breadth of experience, the diversity of stories and reactions, and to want to learn more and maybe kind of go online and listen to that oral history and listen to the people's voices themselves. So one story that has really been resonating with me recently from this chapter is about the moments of uprooting. And it's from Yoshiko Hasegawa, who was born in 1925 and grew up in Vancouver. And she, so she was a young adult. She had just graduated or was in the process of graduating from high school when the orders for uprooting were announced. And so she can remember quite clearly, or she recalls with a lot of detail, what the actions that her parents took in February and March. And I think the events of the past few months have given me an experience of an uncertainty that I haven't had before. And I think that's why the story and stories like these have really resonated with me in a new way, because I can understand just a bit more what it would have felt like to have your life seized and not know, like to truly not be able to control or know what would come, what was going to come next. And so Yoshiko describes that her family, having been given the notice of uprooting and told the baggage limits, bought the biggest suitcases that they could to fill them. And they rented, I believe, in Vancouver, but they worked or owned a restaurant. So they stored some of their dishes from the restaurant with a friend. They sold some other items, but what they couldn't sell because they were specific to Japanese cuisine, their lacquerware and owan or Japanese china, Yoshiko describes that her parents told her to break what remained. And she describes breaking china and burning it. And she, in the I'm paraphrasing, but Yoshiko kind of provides an explanation that they had heard that there was vandalism happening throughout the Pal Street neighborhood already. And so that's the explanation for that she provides. And so to me, that means that's a moment of deciding that rather than having their belongings and what represents their livelihood, rather than having that stolen, they kind of chose to have the final word on what would happen to their the source of their material life. So in our chapter, we weave this into a larger discussion about acts of ownership. So, which I really think, and Jordan took the lead on this, highlight this kind of decision making that Japanese Canadians made in relation to their property and belongings throughout the moments of uprooting. So we talked about all of these moments of reactions, and I think for the readers of the book, this will start to fill in what the dispossession or those moments of uncertainty looked like and how they were lived by Japanese Canadians. The rest of our chapter, it moves forward very generally in time to reflect on stories of making, so rebuilding homes after the uprooting and rebuilding lives in the uneven ways in the decades that followed. And then it finishes with a section on returns, revisiting these places, these sites of dispossession, and stories of a younger generation trying to speak with their parents and learning about this history themselves.
Great, thank you, Kaitlin, and for that book summary as well, which you layered into yours. I think I'll go ahead and ask a small question of each of the three authors, and I'll let you maybe decide who goes first. But thinking either generally about the book or about your specific contribution, I wonder if you could answer, why does this history still matter today?
Because Black lives matter, because Indigenous lives matter, because injustice continues, and because we live in an increasingly racist society.
Nick.
Yeah, I would, that's put powerfully, Audrey, and I think that's echoes my thoughts. I mean, obviously this history matters because the legacies of dispossession are still with us. I mean, this isn't a moment that this story of dispossession has resonances that I of course can't speak to, but others who have whose families were caught up in those histories can speak to directly. For me, I mean, this was a story in part about a radical form and a deeply racist form of devaluation of a group of people who were categorized as and racialized as distinct and different and others and othered and perceived to be a threat, and thus were to be expelled. So it's a story in that sense about racist expulsion, but it's also fundamentally a story about white supremacy and white privilege, which was and continues to be, unfortunately, the basis for a whole series of profound devaluations. I mean, the fact that I can come to you from this house, which I have title on, speaks to those devaluations. It's also, of course, the traditional territory, in my case, of Kwantlen, and Katzie people. But that title, it doesn't have the same valence, the same weight that mine does. And that speaks to deeply racist understandings of people's appropriate relationships to land and to property, where some people, frankly, usually white people, are valued as compared to others. And so we see that story continuing. We see that story continuing also. So I'm working on a project with precariously housed people, many of whom are Indigenous and racialized as well. They're constantly finding that their stuff is being taken and destroyed or stolen by state officials and by private officials. So sadly, this story, and fundamentally, again, it's a story of devaluation, of categorical devaluation, where a group of people are deemed less worthy in terms of the relationships that they have to their things, which again isn't just about stuff, it's about multiple relations of security, of memory, and so on. So unfortunately, these stories matter for very similar reasons that they did in the 1940s.
Yeah, I certainly agree with those sentiments and the ongoing resonance of these histories. I wonder whether Kaitlin, as the historian in our panel, you know, Kaitlin, for you, what role does telling these histories play in relation to those to those ongoing challenges that Nick and Audrey have pointed to?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking as Nick and Audrey were speaking, or like, I guess I've just spent the past few weeks working on our teacher resources, and just I see that really just comes to mind is the power of history to teach through analogy, and the usefulness of that historical distance. It's not a history that's too far away, and I think that it has is very poignant in and of itself. But I see the power of this story to educate, and but I don't think it's just that. I do think that there's a need to continue to simply recognize this story, that it happened within Canada, and the experiences that Japanese Canadians have endured, and the accomplishments of the years that followed. So I think there's an immense power, and it's why it's an exciting time for our project, because we're unveiling all of these educational initiatives.
Great, thank you to all three of the authors. We'll get really quickly to questions from the audience. We'll have a good almost 20 minutes for that. And I'm sure there will be questions. I want to offer just a few words of conclusion before we move to that. I think these presentations have offered a taste of what's in our book. I hope it's something that has piqued curiosity for the audience. We make an effort in the book, as these presentations have conveyed, to recover the stories of Japanese Canadians, from the migration story that Audrey spoke about, through the experience of dispossession and the reactions that Japanese Canadians made, the many diverse reactions that Japanese Canadians made at the time, to the decades thereafter that, that Kaitlin spoke to. We've centered on those experiences in these presentations, but the book also deals with non-Japanese Canadians, government officials, bystanders, witnesses, perpetrators, and beneficiaries of the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. And that has also been a vital part of our research, to understand how do people participate, justify, undertake these kinds of actions. The last several months have laid bare for many of us, and for me, the extent to which anti-Asian racism directed against Japanese Canadians and other Asian Canadians remains rampant in British Columbia and elsewhere in Canada. As someone with close personal relationships now in the Japanese Canadian community, I've been very disturbed to hear stories of verbal assault and harassment of people that I know well and care for. These events reflect, I think, enduring misunderstandings of this country's history. Misunderstandings of who belongs here and who has belonged. Misunderstandings of who Canadians are and of what they look like. I hope that we're in the midst of a moment of change, and my work with young people on this project, Japanese Canadian and not, people like Kaitlin and others, gives me some faith that this is indeed the case, that we are in the midst of a moment of change. So how will we work to protect human and civil rights in future moments of national insecurity? What actions will democratic institutions take to overcome racism? Who is harmed by a politics of fear and who benefits? These questions seem to me, at least, although perhaps historians should hesitate to predict, but seem likely to me to bedevil the coming century, just as they did the past. And our history, I don't think, can save us, can't offer us all of the answers to these challenges, but it is perhaps a tool among others in answering our most pressing questions. I hope that by working together across difference to understand our most difficult pasts, we have some prospect of forging a more just future. I want to share just before we go to your Q&A, I hope that the presentation has interested the audience in the book. I'll put a link here to in the chat to the site where you can purchase the book from a partner of ours on the project, the Nikkei National Museum, where you can buy it online or in person in their bookshop. And the book is also widely available. So I put that link there now so people can connect to it before we end today. And then we can take questions. So we can take questions by folks raising their hands using the Zoom raise hand function, or you could put, as Lillian Nakamura-Maguire just did, a question into chat, or you could unmute your video and go ahead and ask the question by video as well. I'll call on folks when I see you unmuted. So I don't know if Lillian wants to unmute, or I should just read the question. I'll go ahead and read Lillian's question. It may be that you need to raise your hand for us to ask you to unmute to be able to unmute your audio. I'm not sure, Lorraine. So Lillian writes, as you can see in the chat, I understand that there will be an opportunity for communities to have some of the research for displays. How might communities request this? So this is, there are a couple of ways in which communities can access members of the community or communities in organized ways can access the research. But Kaitlin, have you been involved in the mini traveler, which might be one of the ways in which BC communities can access this? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I haven't been too closely involved, but our audience might know that we have museum exhibit launching in Burnaby in the coming weeks. It's about, there we go, titled Broken Promises. It fits into the Nikkei National Museum's exhibit space. So it's not huge, but it's perhaps more expensive than smaller institutions can afford. So currently the museum exhibit team is developing a small traveler exhibit, which will be something much more like a banner display that then I understand those small museums or cultural centers can apply for grants to cover the travel costs. But that's in the works. I could put you in touch with our curatorial team for further details about the timeline for that, but that's underway.
So our principal exhibit will show in Vancouver starting very, very soon. They're just mounting it, and we'll have an official launch, as you can see here, on September 26th. And that will be a live stream event too that you can find on our website, landscapesofinjustice.com. And then we have this traveler that will go to BC communities. After about 8 months at the Nikkei National Museum, this principal exhibit will go to Ontario, to the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre in Toronto. We hope it will still go to Halifax, although COVID has compromised that original plan for the Halifax show. And it'll return to Victoria for a showing at the Royal BC Museum in 2022. I wonder if Mike could speak briefly to the way in which he's sharing community records with members of the community, both through the NAJC and through community-based events.
Oh yeah, thank you. Hi Lillian, and you're pretty familiar with our some of the records, that the case files and the Bird Commission files that we were sharing out there in the Yukon. So for everyone, we will be in January launching a digital archive database, and with that, it's a one-stop shop sort of thing where you can put a name or a place into this database, and it'll pull it'll pull from over 20 archives and repositories that we've been able to obtain research from over the course of the project, from different archives, mainly the Library Archives of Canada, but from all over the Frank Shears, the Rare Books collection, as well as UBC. So, and some from the UK. So you'll be able to just write in, if I put in Abe, actually Kiyokazu Abe or something like that, or my grandfather's Isamu, I'll be able to pull records, whether he had a fishing boat that was sold, or if he had land, or the bird commission. So that will be available to all the public, the Japanese Canadian community and researchers. Is that the question? I can't. Too busy looking for my.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so those are some of the ways in which we're sharing materials with the community. I see a question here from Laura Uanaka. Asking, what was the most surprising finding of your research, and will Landscapes of Justice continue? Is there more funding available? So a couple of things that surprised me along the way. One came from the introduction of our research materials into a grade 5 classroom in Ontario, where our teaching materials have been piloted in 30 classrooms, 30 more classrooms, I think now. And the students were doing an exercise where they came to understand the dispossession of property, in fact, create properties based on historical evidence, and then the teacher dispossess the students of those properties. And the students were really worried as they were uprooted, their kind of avatars were uprooted, and in turn, they were worried what happened to their pets. Many of the kids have pets, and they envisioned that their Japanese Canadian avatars might also have pets. And we didn't know. And so a number of us started looking through archival material to try and find out what happened to the pets. And in another, many of the surprising revelations in this history are horrible revelations in this history, but we found an advertisement in the New Canadian providing euthanization of pets to Japanese Canadians who were being uprooted and interned. So we conveyed that information back to the classroom, and the students were, of course, outraged, and they wrote their own letters of protest, protesting the whole suite of policies, including the loss of their pets. Another thing I'll just add was Kaitlin's research discovery in response to a request from the Victoria Nikkei Cultural Society in town here, who wanted support from our project to, in their campaign to rebuild the tea house that was destroyed here in Victoria. They asked what historical information we can find, and Kaitlin was digging in that area, looked into that, and then also assembled more broadly across the records of the custodian of enemy property, how widespread looting and theft was in the days and weeks after Japanese Canadians were uprooted and interned. And just all across communities in BC, houses were broken into, fences dug under, and I'm really just quoting Kaitlin here. And she and Nick wrote up this material. But for me, that was a big change in how we understood this history, that we had often thought of a policy set in Ottawa and Japanese Canadian responses to that policy. And I think it did convey to town councillors here in Victoria how much local responsibility and how much widespread responsibility there was for this. Raises questions about why do people behave in those ways, but also I think helped to prompt the town council to approve the construction of a new tea house here in Victoria.
I'll just follow on that, Jordan, because I agree that was even, so that Nick and I wrote a chapter on what happened specifically to movable property, which is harder to track than real estate. It can be carried away. And in that chapter, I think, was possibly the last chapter that was written for the book. And that means that the most materials were available to do that research. And I think it's just what we were able to see, even in that chapter, about the breadth of looting and theft and just wrongdoing. It like I think that's just I don't want to be foreboding, but it's the tip of the iceberg. You may be familiar with the type of workshops that Mike is running, where Mike will facilitate families to find their the records that the custodian kept on that specific family, and what is contained within those records are correspondence between officials, and that's where you see that looting. And so I just would like to say that the mass digitization that we've done will allow a new perspective on this history, and one that we'll be able to see more clearly what happened in each community and each locale in a way that just I don't think has been financially possible for researchers before. So I think even though we're, I think I saw promotional material saying that this is the definitive like stance on the dispossession, but I think there's a lot that will come once these records are available.
I see that question also, it included that question about funding. So, I mean, one of the wonderful things about this project has been to work with organizations and people who have been working in this area for a really long time. So the National Association of Japanese Canadians, of course, the Nikkei National Museum, Audrey's been working on this area for a very long time. And so we have graduates, Kaitlin's about to start her PhD at a prestigious university, and we have other graduate students going out into the field. So I know the work of Landscapes of Injustice, you know, will continue and evolve those partners. We're also looking into opportunities to continue to work together, many of the partners in this area, and that, you know, I'm hopeful about, but not, you know, that's all, you know, grant applications and the uncertainties of the future and so on. But I am certain that this work will continue forward in one form or another.
Jordan, can I just say something that, I don't know if this is a surprise. I've been doing this for over 40 years, so I don't know if there are any surprises left. But I just want to mention that our work has all been based on archives, on records, on solid information, which represents a kind of truth. But it's a partial truth. And I just want to mention that there are literally thousands about whom we don't know very much, because maybe the only thing that's recorded about them is their registration number for their little ID card. But there were thousands who didn't own any property. There were thousands of single young men who worked in the sawmills or in fishing, or many of them were starting to work as hotel porters. We don't know very much about them. And it's possible that we could dig up some archival information from labor histories, etc., but we don't have it at the moment. And so I just want to put in a word for all of the nameless, propertyless people for whom our book just can't speak at this time. So that's a project for future research.
Thank you, yeah. We're nearing time, and oh, here comes a question. So we're nearing time, so maybe I'll thank everyone for this, you know, for attending this first hour of our session. As I said, the panelists and I can stay on for another 15 minutes, but I understand that we advertise this as an hour-long session, so if people have other, you know, obligations, dinner, bedtime, range of human obligations that you may have, I just want to thank you all for attending for this hour of discussion. It really is an honor and pleasure to see a lot of familiar names and faces in the Zoom, and to be able to launch the book in a context like this. And thank you so much for the panelists as well for your participation. Having said that, we'll stay on for another 15 minutes. I see a question from Masumi Izumi, who's a scholar in Japan, and I don't know if that means we have a live audience from Japan, or whether Masumi's in Canada right now. But that's exciting. Hi, Masumi. Will the LOI Digital Archives have space to include oral histories done in Japan with the deportees? We're certainly hoping to include archival materials like that. So we weren't able to conduct interviews as part of this project in Japan, but I'm certainly hoping that we'll be able to connect our archival work with the work of other projects, including ongoing projects in Japan, and to build a connected resource of materials that can tell this story also in connection with that one. So if there may be an offline conversation, assuming for us to have together about that. I see some thanks coming in. I don't know if we have additional questions coming in. Catherine Oikawa, one of our teachers who participated this summer, just bought a copy. Thank you, Catherine.
There's from Izumi Sakamoto. Did you find anything that shows the interactions with Indigenous communities, i.e. other dispossessed groups from the area? I can speak to that. Well, I guess I can speak to that from the perspective of digitizing the materials and just going through them. Those connections are there in this record group, and so I sound like an archive nut, but like that in the process of digitizing this, it will be possible to follow that question. But it's not something that's featured centrally or in this book, just because we focused on the story in the 1940s. But there are, without getting into too many details, I think once the archive is available, you'll be able to do that sort of research.
Maybe one of us can grab the link to the Landscapes of Injustice working paper by Laura Shiguro and Nicole Yakashiro and Will Archibald, whose research explores some of those connections through our archival material, and is a really great working paper that's informed discussions on the project.
But could I just mention, since we've talked a little bit about the Right to Remain, which I see as kind of a sister project, that the implications between the Japanese Canadian and Indigenous communities today are absolutely huge, because the largest group of people who are living in those homes from which Japanese Canadians were taken are Indigenous, or at least a very large part of them. And anyone who works with the Powell Street Festival Society, and there may be a few of them here, will know that those links are very strong today, that there are Japanese Canadians who are working very hard in the downtown East Side as part of an ongoing sense of furthering justice and housing and the right to remain. Nick might have more to say about that too.
Yeah, and I mean there are crucial threads, and I think profound sense of kind of allyship that's I've been really impressed by and struck by, and of course entangled histories of dispossession, different sorts of dispossession. I mean this question of course Indigenous dispossession and Japanese Canadian dispossession was one that we grappled with in the paper that Mike just posted. Seeks to try and recognize those differences, but also those commonalities. And so speaking to that history and those entanglements is something that that Landscapes has grappled with, and Right to Remain continues to engage with in all sorts of important ways. I mean, and this speaks in part to, of course, the histories of Japanese Canadians, as Audrey can point to, who were managing or in some cases owning rooming houses and what become known as SROs in places like the downtown east side that she alluded to earlier on, and the forcible expulsion of that population, we think had all sorts of ultimately very negative consequences for SROs as a housing stock.
Thank you, Nick and Audrey. Yeah. Are there other questions I haven't seen yet? We have a few comments. Vivian, who's the chair of our community council, put in a comment. Thank you to the NAJC for hosting. It's not just Japanese Canadian history, this is Canadian history. And Lorraine responded to that. And Art, who's another contributor to our book, offered some support. Thank you, Art. And a beautiful note from Lisa Wakabayashi. Are there any other questions, or are we at? I
think, can I just pick up on that thread that Lisa raised? I mean, this was something that became very clear to me very early on in the project. I mean, when you're an academic, particularly one who doesn't maybe have familial connections with this story, it's somewhat easy to depersonalize it. But of course, these are very personal stories, and that became very clear to us. The community council who were involved made that very clear to us pointy-headed academics, that we're not just talking about data, we're talking about aunties and grandfathers and so on. And that to me was very humbling, and I'm deeply grateful for that, for the contributions people like Vivian made in that regard.
There's a question that might be directed at Audrey here from Donna Buck. Did Perry's forceful opening of Japan have anything to do with Japanese movement to Canada? She asked.
In an indirect way, I wouldn't give Perry too much credit. In that, yes, he did force some external relations, but I think that he was one element in a process that was going on in which a society was being transformed. And I don't think it was transformed just because of Perry. But in a way, he was there. He was kind of there at the start of this modernization, industrialization. Some people call it democratization. I'm not sure if that's right, but it was certainly a change in citizenship status. And without all of those things, without the big transition from the Tokugawa to the Meiji era, Japanese emigration to Canada would have been very, very different.
Okay. Well, I think I see lots of thanks and congratulations, which are wonderful. It's a very gratifying period in the project to see the book come out, certainly, and the other outputs. But it looks like we may have answered the questions that people have this evening, at least. So again, thank you very much to all of the audience members who tuned in. And again, to the panelists for their presentations, and I hope that some of you will attend that launch of the museum exhibit, which is quite different, and we'll have a different cast of characters presenting. Although there'll be some overlap, I'll be there as well, which is September 26th. Maybe I'll just put that information up again. September 26th at the Nikkei National Museum with a live stream presentation. And we haven't got a link yet for that live stream presentation, but it'll be available soon, and it'll be available on our website, landscapesofinjustice.com. So thanks again to the NAJC, to Laureen for hosting, and for Kevin for organizing, and good night to everyone.
Yes. Thank you, Jordan.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much, everyone.
See you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.